Hi, today I want to talk about cities, but as is always the case with these videos, it's not an urbanism discussion, but rather about how cities affect creativity, innovation, great work, individual destinies, and on. Many argue that this topic of cities isn't discussed enough, that we are not being active enough in choosing where we live. And this is something many argue that where you live has the biggest impact on your destiny. So the place is making the person. We have to think about that. We'll try to think about that. But in these discussions, we are interested in creativity and genius, great work. So, how do cities fit into this framework? And can we apply our AIC, awareness, intent, creativeness framework to cities? Thinking about the knowledge, the intent, the courage, and the creativeness, the work that can result from these great factors of accumulation and plurality. We'll try to look at some historical perspectives, but is the city unlikely? Do you prefer the city life or is rural life better? Is it more fun to be just careless in the wilderness? There are so many stories like this. So, how can the city, living in the city, going to the city, being in the city, affect you if you are interested in creativity, innovation, achievement, and the impact? Overall, this discussion on cities fits, even though we are usually talking about creative individuals, great individuals, genius work. But this particular discussion of cities as innovation systems and as creativity systems fits because it gives us a very interesting and broad view how plurality affects collective and individual creativeness. What we will do is we will talk about the historical story of cities, cities in culture, cities as cultural melting pots, cities in art, and then we will talk a little bit about individual destiny. So the city and the individual destiny, individual creativity. And finally, we will talk about cities and economic creativity. So cities as economic powerhouses, cities as innovation hubs, and cities as engines of inequality and disparity. And we will see how all of these factors fit together so that we can reflect on the future of cities and on our own attitude in choosing to live in a city in general or even which city to live in. So, how cities came into existence and their survival are very interesting stories to think about. So, if we think about humans as hunter gatherers, the invention of agriculture, so to speak, marked a certain change in lifestyle, right? The nomadic, always moving lifestyle where you are constantly looking for food. Sometimes you have to move from one place to another because of safety concerns, because of shelter, because of the weather. This form of life that was associated with being a hunter gatherer started changing with the invention of agriculture. Now we have stable settlements, but with the stable settlements, there was higher economic productivity. So you could produce more food. And so more people could live in one place. And this evolution, the advent of agriculture, led to the beginning of a form of accumulation, in a sense, economic accumulation. And people started to gather more. As they gathered more, they needed more services. And we had settlements becoming bigger and bigger. And as these settlements became bigger, you started needing administrative staff. You started needing people who will provide protection, support. You started needing priests, probably. So the advent of agriculture, these first settlements, led to a continuous process of accumulation. And then cities started growing and they developed into empires and they had bureaucracies within them. And these administrations are very interesting because if you think of it from a purely economic perspective, these people are wasteful. They don't generate food, they don't create economic value by themselves, but they are somehow needed to maintain order and to provide certain services that the food creator doesn't have but need. So, in a sense, this waste, so to speak, in the form of administrators, soldiers, this economic waste leads to something else, right? And this is something we say in innovation, that in order to be able to innovate, a certain degree of waste is needed because innovation is connected to trial and error, is connected to having this luxury of the ability to spend time tinkering or exploring, in a sense, right? This is what science is. We get somebody, your role in life is to think and to explore, and this is some money. In terms of the economic equation, in terms of the most basic economic equations, these things don't directly lead to economic creativity. But in the case of cities, they are very important. When we talk about the creativity of cities, we talk about so many different forms of creativity. We talk about social creativity or organizational and political creativity. The new forms of government, the new forms of human interaction were developed and created in response to certain needs that were created by cities. Of course, we talk about economic creativity, the creation of new opportunities, the creation of more wealth, more food, more economic resources of all different kinds. And this includes innovation, but is not limited to innovation. And we also talk about cultural creativity. So cities can be thought of as cultural melting pots, even if you think of cities as comprising of different communities of individuals living in different places. There will always be areas of intersection between them. And these areas of intersection are places where different cultures come in contact and they lead to new creations. There are always places of commonality in cities, and this leads to the formation of a collective intelligence, of a bubbling spirit of exchange of ideas, of thoughts. Cities also can function as incubators for social movements and cultural movements. Plus, there is a certain thing called a golden effect associated with cities. Some cities have a particular period in which they just shine because there are all these amazing people who come together and geniuses affect each other. There is both homogeneity and homophily. They attract each other, but they also affect each other. And we have this golden age effect, like Paris in the 1920s, like Vienna in the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century. And this is because of the intensity of the human experience that can happen in a city. And remember that many cities design to maximize interactions. They want this level of interactions, of connectivity between different people, especially between creative individuals, because of all the potential that this can lead to. So this cultural evolution is an ongoing process in cities, and it is always carried forward by different individuals, by cultural and social movements. And it has always reflected itself in art. We can track it. It is a beautiful indicator of the plurality of experiences. And we will talk about plurality and density in one of the coming sections as well. But here are a couple of thoughts about depictions of the city in art, and we will take this and think about it from a different dimension in the next section and the one after that. So sometimes artists look at cities as beautiful in their plurality, beautiful in their richness, and they associate the city with certain individual interpretations, with beauty, with potential, with creativeness, as we are talking. But also sometimes cities are associated with the opposite of this. They are associated with being isolated, desolate, being polluted, barren, criminal even. And we will talk about that next. I want to close with this short passage from The Wasteland, Eliot's The Wasteland. And he is describing London, but it carries some of these meanings we have been talking about. So he says, "Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many, I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet." So these are the themes of plurality, the multitude, the crowd. But yet you are lonely in the crowd, and this is something we will talk about next. I want to start from the last few lines to reflect on individual destiny and the city. In The Wasteland, in this section about London, there are a number of beautiful and prototypical images about the city. So there is this huge crowd, the multitude, so many, but they are all silent, exhaling in short and infrequent bursts and looking at their feet, right? This is the image there. And it kind of reflects this idea of I'm lonely in the middle of all this crowd, right? Lonely in the middle of the crowd. And this has always been one of the images associated with the city, this image of social isolation. Now, the idea of social isolation in the middle of the crowd is kind of very interesting because this ability, this connection from all these close social ties carries in itself a lot of potential, right? You are given some kind of freedom to transform, a freedom for reinvention, transformation, personal change. This is a blessing. It's a positive opportunity because sometimes close social and cultural relationships can be stifling. They can prevent one from changing as much as they would like and from becoming who they imagine they should become. Okay, so this social isolation that kind of feels desolate, barren, scary. Loneliness is scary, but the quest is a lonely place. Not everybody goes for these long, hard challenges. Okay, so this is the first point related to the city. The other is related to plurality, to the multitude, to the crowd. So there are many people competing. There is a high level of competition. There is a lot of speed, a lot of aggression, and this is always or frequently associated with images of the city. And so this higher degree of competition, this speed and aggression are associated with survival of the fittest, right? Survival of the fittest means that you better improve your game, you better try harder, you better become tougher, or you will sink into oblivion, okay? And so this competitiveness of cities pushes us to become better, to prepare better. And so the city as an individual test, it kind of gives potential, this loneliness. And some people look at it as a disconnection, as we said, but it carries in itself a blessing. And this is the blessing of reinvention. And again, the highly competitive nature, it pushes many people to try as hard as they can. Now, there are negative effects, right? Because when you have survival of the fittest, you will have victims. And these two dimensions are very interesting sides of the same coin in a sense. Another phenomenon associated with cities is the rise of the creative class. And this is something like people like Richard Florida, he pioneered the idea, he talks about it. So there is this idea of new types of jobs that depend more on knowledge, on innovation and creativity. And these jobs are associated with cities naturally. We started one of the previous stories by thinking about how cities created opportunities for all these administrators and soldiers and so on. All these people that don't add economic value in a sense. But the evolution of services in cities has created the need for people who can create more value, for more services, for people who need to always reinvent and innovate and be creative. Okay, and so the creative class, the percentage of workers who work in knowledge related fields or who work in jobs that require some degree of creativity is on the rise, and it is particularly on the rise in cities. It's closely associated with cities, not rural areas, obviously. Well, because creativity, invention, knowledge, innovation are always associated with multitude, with cultural progressiveness, with movement, with speed. These are things quite present in city. Finally, so is your location your destiny? We will think about this here and we will think about it again later. Now, I had assumed that cities provide a high degree of social mobility. Social mobility is defined as the ability of an individual to move from their current economic or social condition to a different one. Turns out that there might be some nuance to the data. Some cities indeed provide higher levels of social mobility, but not all of them. And even though some cities can provide this high degree of social mobility, it seems that increasingly rural areas are providing competitive, equal, if not better, rates of social mobility. There are a couple of studies I saw about this. So the close cultural ties that don't exist in cities, the centrality of the family unit, all of these things affect destiny in a sense. There are some cities that have a predominant personality style. And so you might imagine that either the community is shaping people in that way, or it's just that these groups of people came here. And to me, it seems that the first one is the more likely scenario. So why don't we leave cities if they are associated with all these difficulties, strife, speed, and so on? Well, because the benefits seem to outweigh the disadvantages, the risks, and so on, the social, economic, health related, and even cultural benefits. So, next, in this exploration of the beautiful relationship between cities, creativity, and innovation, I want to talk about the economic elements. I want to talk about first cities as economic powerhouses. So, cities provide a certain economic density that is needed, an infrastructure, a big number of elements that we mentioned before when we were talking about the evolution of cities, the development of cities, and the accumulation of resources in cities on a bigger and a more comprehensive scale. So cities will have institutions, cities will have production, firms, agents, they will have a number of services. Science tends to develop in cities near universities, near academic institutions. And all of this economic density leads to more creativity, leads to more economic creativity, leads to growth, leads to progress in a sense. And we mentioned that cities, as they became richer, they evolved into empires. And what happened is that now cities have more resources. They act as a central magnet. They attract economic resources from other places, and they attract human resources too. And this leads to more centralization and more stickiness, so to speak, of economic activity, right? Think about it. This is how it works. So firms gather in one place, they start working together. People come because of all these services, but the new people require more services, and this demands more people and more workers and more services. Add and on, of course. Add military and political imperial growth to that, and you will get a very interesting image of how some of these things evolved, right? Some of the cities that people consider the most beautiful or glorious in history were centers of empires. And because they were centers of empires, they were able to attract economic and human resources. Some might call it abuse. Human resources from different and even faraway places. Okay, so this economic density tends to be continuous, tends to self-feed or to self-sustain because it keeps bringing human resources. And you can see it around the cities. There are all these people coming to the city even if they are living in conditions that are worse off compared to where they came from, because of the economic opportunities, because of future aspirations, because of growth, because of the centralization of all these services. Okay. Second, cities as innovation hubs. Now, it is not natural, if we have all this economic density, if we have all this economic centralization, that innovation and progress will tend to happen in cities. First, there is density. So innovation requires density, creativity requires density. We have more minds, we have more ideas, and we have more successful ideas, in a sense. This is an obvious implication. Cities bring different talents from different fields, and you need different talents to work together to cross-pollinate, to create new products and new ideas. Many historical examples on that. There is also the infrastructure, of course. So universities, research labs, galleries, funding institutions, all of these things, when they are present in close proximity, they will tend to generate more economic opportunities. Right? Even though this is somehow being redefined with digital nomadism, something we'll talk about. It is still this ability of cities to provide infrastructures that are not available easily in different places, that keep attracting talent and so keep attracting more economic opportunities. And finally, there's a very interesting point which is related to serendipity. A lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, a lot of invention happen by chance. But chance, if we assume it's a probabilistic random event, then it will be a function of the total volume, right? The total quantity. So the more people there are, the more firms there are, the more attempts there are, the more likely it is that some will come together and some of these sudden or unexpected encounters will result in an economic success or some kind of cultural creative output, right? So these factors tend, the plurality here again tends to play in favor of the economic growth, the consistent economic dominance of cities, but also the progress related, the change related dimension, which is connected to innovation as it will keep on moving forward. Now, I want to talk a little bit quickly about the flip, the dark side here. And this is related to inequality, disparity, pollution, and social mobility from the other side. Now, first, I mentioned that you would expect that cities will provide higher degrees of social mobility, the ability of people to move beyond their social class. But increasingly, not all cities seem able to do that. In fact, many cities perform worse than rural areas. This is something very important to think about. When there is growth, there seems to be inequality, and we have a number of studies that say that cities seem to be witnessing increasing degrees of inequality with time. So higher degrees of inequality means that there are more differences between people. And if you have an idea about psychology, you will know that this has a huge effect on people's happiness and well-being. So inequality, disparity, and of course, pollution. So cities are generally associated with higher degrees of pollution, and this can lead to adverse health outcomes. But this particular trend seems to be countered by the presence of more advanced health services in cities. So this view, this realistic economic view of cities, helps us balance the positive progress related sides connected to size, density, economic weight, but also economic progress and growth, balanced with some negative outcomes that all of us need to consider. Because we said here we are reflecting on whether we should move to a city or to which city. And again, we'll look at that in the final section. So I want to conclude this discussion on cities, their relationships with creativity, with innovation, by looking at 3 points. One, the future of cities. How are they evolving? So we now have a number of initiatives worldwide, a number of approaches trying to redesign cities, trying to augment all the advantages associated with cities while managing or minimizing the negative aspects related to pollution, social isolation, and so on. There are concepts, experiments in mobility, in movement, in cultural interactivity, shared spaces, cities or districts as innovation hubs, districts as cultural areas, and so on. I read that there were a couple of initiatives in Copenhagen, in Paris, trying to redesign living spaces so that everything you need is available to you within walking distance. And so this approach has in mind well-being, right? Trying to maximize people's well-being, trying to maximize people's happiness by utilizing some of the economic resources already present there and controlling the negative aspects related to pollution, social isolation, inequality that we talked about. Here, there is an interesting phenomenon that is also affecting this. It's the phenomenon of digital nomads or digital creative people. And we have a number of cities all over the world doing their best to attract these creative people, and we have a bigger number of individuals who live in one city and work in another. And this kind of raises interesting social and cultural questions about the evolution of cities and about the thing we mentioned before about how cities make people and how cultures tend to reflect on individuals. How will this change as more and more digital nomads move to new places? And as if it does work, innovation and innovative activity gets more dispersed in different places. And this takes us to the next question: where to live? Why didn't we leave cities? As we mentioned before, the negative aspects are kind of outweighed by all the positive ones. But why don't we leave? It has never been easier to design your own adventure and to live in different cities, to experience different cities, depending, of course, if you have the economic resources for it, but on average. And so this takes us to the idea of all these opportunities in different cities. There are opportunities, there are infrastructures, there are a number of options to work with, right? But you have to ask the question, which opportunities are more relevant to you? It is not a one size fits all. It is related to what do you want to do or what is your great work. And many of us don't know. And so the question here is, well, if you don't know what your great work is, maybe the crowd, the plurality, the multitude, the city can help you. But you still have to figure out which crowd.